Imagine you are driving along a sun-bleached stretch of California coastline. To your right, the Pacific Ocean stretches into an infinite, shimmering blue. To your left, there are only rolling, golden hills, parched and empty under a vast sky. It is a landscape of rugged, almost brutal simplicity. And then you see it. Perched atop the highest of these hills, like a mirage or a fever dream, is a palace. It is not a Californian building. It is a Spanish cathedral, a Roman temple, a European fantasy shimmering in the heat haze, miles from anything. Twin bell towers reach for the sky, flanked by colonnades of impossible whiteness. It does not belong here. It is a deliberate and magnificent mistake. This is the estate known as La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. We know it today as Hearst Castle. It is a work of architectural schizophrenia, a place built of staggering beauty and profound contradiction. It is both a museum and a home, a fortress and a playground, a masterpiece and a monument to an obsession so vast it could move mountains and import entire European monasteries piece by numbered piece. But a building like this does not simply appear. It is willed into existence. It is the physical manifestation of a single, towering ego. So who was the man who dared to place a Spanish city on a lonely California hill? What was he trying to build? And more importantly, what was he trying to escape? What ghosts haunted these marble halls? And what secrets are still held within its silent, gilded rooms? To understand this impossible castle, we must first understand the man who dreamed it. We must journey back, beyond the glamour and the legends, to the very source of the ambition, the insecurity, and the insatiable hunger that gave it life. His name was William Randolph Hearst, and the story of his castle is the story of a man who tried to build a wall against reality itself. He was wrong. To find the seed of Hearst Castle, you must first look not to William, but to his father. George Hearst was a man carved from the raw material of the American West. He was born in a log cabin in Missouri, barely literate, with hands calloused from the earth. He went west not with a dream of culture, but with a lust for minerals. He had a preternatural ability to read the land, to sense the hidden veins of silver and gold sleeping beneath the rock. He struck it rich, not just rich, but titanically, volcanically wealthy, pulling fortunes from the Comstock lode in Nevada and the Homestake mine in South Dakota. George Hearst was a force of nature. He was loud, uncouth, perpetually stained with tobacco juice, and utterly uninterested in the delicate sensibilities of polite society. He was a senator, but he was never a statesman. He was a millionaire, but he was never a gentleman. And he had a son. William Randolph Hearst was born in 1863, the sole heir to this colossal, unrefined fortune. From his first breath, he was a paradox, the son of a frontiersman raised in a world of unimaginable privilege. His mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, was the antithesis of her husband. She was a quiet, cultured former schoolteacher who saw in her son the chance to create what her husband could never be, a man of taste, of refinement, of European sophistication. While George was digging in the dirt of the West, Phoebe was taking young William on grand tours of the Old World. He was 10 years old when he first saw the castles of Europe. He walked through the Louvre, his eyes wide. He stood beneath the soaring vaults of cathedrals that had stood for 1,000 years. He saw history not as a story in a book, but as a physical, tangible thing. He saw power expressed not through gold mines and cattle ranches, but through art, architecture, and lineage. He learned that the oldest, most respected families did not simply have money. They had collections. They had tapestries that had witnessed royal intrigue, ceilings that had been painted by masters, and stone floors that had been worn smooth by generations of noble feet. A powerful idea began to form in the young boy's mind. It was the conviction that history, beauty, and legitimacy could be acquired. They could be bought. This was the fundamental schism in his soul. He inherited his father's ravenous ambition and his instinct for conquest, but his mother instilled in him a desperate yearning for a cultural pedigree his family name entirely lacked. The Hearst name meant new money. It meant raw, brute force. William wanted it to mean something more. He wanted it to mean dynasty. He was expelled from Harvard University for a series of elaborate and expensive pranks, a classic gesture of a young man with too much money and a desperate need for attention. He did not want to join his father in the mining business. That was the past. He saw the future, and it was in the business of shaping public opinion. He convinced his father to give him control of a failing newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner. This would be his new mine. But instead of digging for silver, he would mine for stories, for scandals, for sensations. He created a new kind of journalism, loud, aggressive, and shamelessly sensational. He understood, better than anyone, that the public did not just want news. They wanted drama. They wanted heroes and villains, tragedy and triumph. He gave it to them in screaming headlines and bold illustrations. He built a media empire, the largest in the world, acquiring newspapers in every major American city. He became one of the most powerful men in the country, a kingmaker who could start wars, destroy political careers, and shape the thoughts of millions of Americans every single day. He had the power. He had the money. But he still did not have the legitimacy he craved. He was still George Hearst's boy, the boorish son of a mining baron, viewed with suspicion and contempt by the old money establishment of the East Coast. He served in Congress but was soundly defeated in his runs for mayor of New York City and governor of New York, humiliations that stung him deeply. He learned a bitter lesson. You could not force the establishment to accept you. So, he would build a world where he did not need their acceptance. He would build his own establishment. His personal life was just as complex and stage-managed. He married Millicent Wilson, a beautiful dancer, and they had 5 sons. It was a respectable, public-facing marriage. But the great love of his life, the central figure in his personal drama, was another woman entirely. Her name was Marion Davies. She was a brilliant comedic actress, a star of the silent screen, full of life and a radiant, unpretentious charm. He met her when she was a young chorus girl, and he was a married, middle-aged media mogul. He was utterly captivated. He poured millions into her film career, building her a custom bungalow on the studio lot, and promoting her films relentlessly in his newspapers. Their relationship was an open secret, a scandal that further isolated him from the polite society he both despised and courted. He could never marry her, but he could build a kingdom for her, and he knew exactly where to build it. Since his childhood, his family had owned a vast tract of land in Central California, a 250,000-acre ranch that sprawled from the mountains to the sea. As a boy, he had camped there with his father, sleeping under the stars on a rugged hilltop they simply called Camp Hill. It was his sanctuary, his escape. In 1919, his mother Phoebe died. He inherited everything. Now, at the age of 56, with near limitless resources and a burning need to create a world of his own design, he sent a telegram to his chosen architect, a brilliant San Franciscan named Julia Morgan. The telegram was simple. It read, "Miss Morgan, we are tired of camping out in tents at the ranch. I would like to build a little something." That little something would become a project of breathtaking obsession, a construction that would continue for nearly 30 years and would never, in his lifetime, be officially complete. It was the beginning of Hearst Castle. This was never going to be just a house. A house is a place you live in. Hearst was building something else entirely. He was building a stage. He was building a filter through which he could experience the world and through which the world could experience him, but only on his terms. It was a fortress of privacy and a theater of power, built on a remote hill to keep the untidy, disappointing world at bay. The very choice of location is the first key to his psychology. Why here? Why build a European palace in the middle of a California wilderness, hours from any major city? Because the isolation was the point. To get to Hearst Castle in its heyday, you had to be personally invited. You would take a private train from Los Angeles to a special siding, where a fleet of cars would be waiting to ferry you up the winding 5-mile road to the summit. The journey itself was a test, a deliberate process of separating his guests from their ordinary lives and immersing them in his world. By the time you arrived, you had left America behind. You were in Hearstland. The choice of architect was equally telling. Julia Morgan was a pioneer, one of the first and most respected female architects in the country. She was a graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, a master of historical styles. But more than that, she was patient, pragmatic, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to translate Hearst's mercurial, ever-changing visions into concrete and steel. She was not a creator of a singular vision. She was the ultimate enabler of his. Their collaboration was a strange dance of creativity and command. Hearst would be in Europe, cabling Morgan with new instructions. Have bought a 14th century Spanish ceiling. Please design a room for it. He was not building a house and then furnishing it. He was acquiring magnificent, ancient objects, fireplaces from French chateaux, choir stalls from Spanish monasteries, Roman sarcophagi, entire ceilings, and then ordering his architect to construct a building around them. The castle became a collage, a scrapbook of European history, torn from its context and reassembled according to the whims of one man. This is the architecture of total control. By literally buying Europe's past, he was attempting to graft a sense of history and ancient legitimacy onto his own, very new American fortune. He could not be a Medici by birth, but he could own a Medici's ceiling. He could not have a royal lineage, but he could sleep in a bed intended for a cardinal and dine under tapestries that had hung in a prince's hall. It was a shortcut to aristocracy, an attempt to purchase the one thing his money could not otherwise create, a noble past. The style he and Morgan settled on was primarily Spanish colonial revival, a pastiche of Mediterranean influences. It was a romantic fantasy, a dream of old-world grandeur perfectly suited to the sun-drenched California landscape. The main building, Casa Grande, with its soaring cathedral towers, was designed to look as if it had grown organically over centuries, like a European hill town. It was a manufactured history, brilliantly executed. The pure white buildings against the deep blue sky created a stunning, almost theatrical effect. The sheer scale of the undertaking is difficult to comprehend. For 3 decades, this remote hilltop was a swarm of activity. Hundreds of laborers lived on site in a temporary village. A special railway spur had to be built just to bring materials up the mountain. Concrete was poured by the ton. Marble was imported from Italy, tiles from Spain, and entire rooms from across Europe. The cost was astronomical, estimated to be close to $10 million in the 1930s, a sum that would be hundreds of millions today. And Hearst oversaw every detail. He would review Morgan's blueprints and scrawl changes in the margins, demanding a window be moved, a wing be expanded, a terrace be redesigned. He was constantly building, tearing down and rebuilding. The process was the point. The act of creation was his obsession. And what of the house itself? It is a study in deliberate contrasts. The exterior, while grand, has a certain monastic simplicity, a whitewashed purity. But step inside, and you are plunged into a world of overwhelming, almost suffocating opulence. The assembly room, where guests would gather before dinner, is a vast hall dominated by a fireplace so large you could stand inside it. Priceless Flemish tapestries line the walls, and the ceiling, carved and painted, was taken from an Italian palace. Every surface is laden with art, with treasure, with history. It is not designed for human comfort. It is designed to awe, to intimidate, to impress upon the visitor the immense wealth and taste of their host. There is no central hallway, no easy way to navigate. The house is a labyrinth of rooms, each a different historical fantasy. There is a Gothic library with priceless illuminated manuscripts, a billiard room with another spectacular Spanish ceiling. The refectory or dining hall is a medieval banquet hall with a long trestle table set with silver and paper napkins, a strange mix of regal formality and casual ranch life. High above, silk banners from Siena hang, a silent, colorful audience to the nightly dinners. The entire estate was an architecture of control, designed to manage not just space, but people. The house was the filter. He was the king in his castle, and everyone else was a guest, subject to his rules and his schedule. By the late 1920s, the dream had become a reality. The Enchanted Hill was no longer a construction site. It was the most famous and exclusive private residence in the world, and Hearst was ready to hold court. The golden age of Hearst Castle was a spectacle unlike any other in American history. It was the Xanadu of the Jazz Age, a fantasy palace where the worlds of Hollywood, politics, and media collided in a whirlwind of glamour and power. To receive an invitation to San Simeon was to have arrived. Imagine a weekend in the 1930s. You arrive by private train, are driven up the winding road, and step out into the brilliant California sunshine. The air is scented with orange blossoms and sea salt. Before you stands Casa Grande, its white towers blazing against the sky. Servants appear to take your bags. You are shown to your room in one of the guest houses, Casa del Mar, Casa del Monte, or Casa del Sol, each a miniature palace in its own right, filled with priceless antiques. The days were deceptively casual. Guests were free to wander the estate, to ride horses along the miles of trails, to play tennis on the immaculate courts, or to swim in one of two swimming pools that have since become legendary. The outdoor Neptune pool was a Roman fantasy, a 104-foot-long marble basin flanked by classical colonnades and statues, overlooking the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. It was a pool fit for the gods. The indoor Roman pool was a different kind of marvel, a subterranean jewel box where every surface, walls, ceiling, floor, was covered in millions of tiny mosaic tiles of shimmering blue and brilliant gold. To swim there was to feel as if you were bathing in liquid lapis lazuli. But this casual freedom was an illusion. Everything was scheduled. Everything was observed. The true heart of the castle experience was dinner. At precisely 7:30, a bell would toll. Guests were expected to gather in the assembly room for cocktails. Hearst himself would make his entrance, often with Marion Davies on his arm, and circulate among his guests. He was a surprisingly shy and soft-spoken man in person, a stark contrast to the bombastic persona of his newspapers. He would observe, he would listen, a quiet puppet master pulling the strings of his own magnificent show. Dinner was served in the refectory, that soaring medieval hall. The scene was surreal. Charlie Chaplin might be seated next to Winston Churchill. Greta Garbo across from George Bernard Shaw, Clark Gable and Carol Lombard, Cary Grant, the Marx Brothers. The guest list was a constellation of the most famous people on earth. They sat at the long table, on hard wooden chairs taken from a monastery, using sterling silver cutlery alongside bottles of Heinz ketchup. This was the essential Hearst paradox, the fusion of unimaginable European luxury with a kind of folksy American informality. He was serving baronial splendor, but reminding everyone that he was still at heart a Californian rancher. The house was undeniably a tool of power. Hearst conducted business here, brokering deals, shaping political careers, and directing his vast media empire via a bank of private telephones. He could reward his friends and allies with an invitation and punish his enemies with exclusion. He had successfully created his own universe with its own rules and its own social hierarchy, and he was its undisputed son. He had attracted the very people he sought to impress, not by joining their world, but by creating one so spectacular they could not resist entering his. For Marion Davies, the castle was her stage. She was the effervescent, unofficial hostess, the warm, funny heart of the cold, grand palace. She put guests at ease, organized games, and threw legendary costume parties. While Hearst was the brooding, watchful king, Marion was the life of the party, the human element that made the overwhelming grandeur feel, for a moment, like a home. But was it a home? Even at its vibrant peak, there was a profound emptiness at the core of the enchanted hill. The scale of the rooms dwarfed human intimacy. The endless halls, filled with the silent eyes of statues and portraits, were lonely places. Guests reported feeling a sense of unease, of being constantly watched, not just by their host, but by the house itself. It was a house built for crowds, not for quiet contemplation. When the parties were over and the famous guests had departed, the silence must have been deafening. It was a golden cage for Marion and ultimately for Hearst himself. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but fortresses are also prisons. He had surrounded himself with beauty, with treasure, with the most exciting people of his age. But genuine connection, the kind that cannot be curated or controlled, was elusive. The grandeur created a distance. He was the host, the patron, the impresario, always slightly apart from the joy he was orchestrating. The parties were dazzling. The guest list was impeccable. The palace was a triumph of will and wealth. For a glorious decade, William Randolph Hearst was the master of his own perfect, self-contained universe. But the real world, the one he had tried so hard to wall off, was about to come crashing in. No wall can stand forever. No fortune is infinite, and no man can control the relentless march of time. The perfect world Hearst had constructed on his enchanted hill was built on a foundation of debt and delusion, and in the 1930s that foundation began to crack. The first tremor was the Great Depression. The economic cataclysm that brought the nation to its knees also shook the foundations of the Hearst empire. Advertising revenues plummeted. Newspaper circulation fell. The vast, sprawling corporation was hemorrhaging money. For years, Hearst had been spending with reckless abandon, not just on the castle, but on his art collection, his real estate, his lavish lifestyle. He had financed his empire on credit, borrowing vast sums to acquire more newspapers, more radio stations, more power. Now, the bills were coming due. By 1937, the situation was dire. The Hearst Corporation was on the brink of collapse, buried under an astonishing $126 million of debt. The man who had once dictated terms to presidents was forced into the ultimate humiliation. he had to cede control of his own empire. A conservator was appointed by his creditors to oversee the company's finances and begin the painful process of dismantling parts of his life's work. This was the public capitulation, a blow to his pride from which he would never fully recover. The puppet master had his strings cut. He was forced to sell off radio stations and newspapers. Worse, to raise cash, he had to begin selling the one thing that defined him, his art collection. Crates of antiques, armor, and paintings were shipped out from his warehouses. The process of accumulation, his lifelong obsession, was thrown into reverse. It was a public bleeding, a symbol of his waning power. At the same time, a personal tragedy was unfolding, a pivotal event that revealed the absolute powerlessness of his wealth in the face of human frailty. While the exact details remain shrouded in the secrecy that Hearst so expertly commanded, the story of the death of film producer Thomas Ince aboard Hearst's yacht in 1924 had long haunted him. Rumors swirled for years that Ince had been accidentally shot by Hearst, who was aiming for Charlie Chaplin in a jealous rage over Marion Davies. While never proven, the dark whisper of scandal clung to him, a reminder that even within his controlled world, violence and chaos could erupt without warning. It was a crack in the facade of serene omnipotence, but the greater tragedy was slower, a quiet decay. As his financial power waned, so did his political influence. He was becoming an anachronism. His brand of sensational, warmongering journalism was falling out of fashion. A new generation of leaders was rising, men who did not seek his counsel or fear his wrath. The world was changing, and he was being left behind. The castle itself began to change. The endless construction slowed to a halt. The parties became less frequent, the guest list less dazzling. The once vibrant stage of triumph began its transformation into a house of loneliness. World War II cast a long shadow over the hill. The bright lights of the castle were dimmed for fear of Japanese submarines off the coast. The mood shifted from celebratory to somber. Hearst and Marion retreated further into the isolation of San Simeon. He was in his 70s, his health failing. The castle, once his greatest weapon and proudest creation, now became his gilded prison. He would sit in the Gothic library, surrounded by the treasures of centuries, a lonely king in a silent, echoing kingdom. The house that was built to entertain hundreds now held just two aging figures, rattling around in its cavernous spaces. It was a monument to shattered dreams, a testament to the fact that you could build a paradise on earth, but you could not stop yourself from growing old within it. His control, once absolute, was gone. He could no longer command the world from his hilltop. He could no longer shape reality with the force of his will and the depth of his wallet. He was just an old man, surrounded by beautiful, inanimate things, facing the one antagonist he could never defeat, his own mortality. In 1947, his health deteriorated to the point where the doctors insisted he leave the remote castle for better medical care in Beverly Hills. He never wanted to leave. The enchanted hill was the landscape of his soul, the only place he felt truly existed, but he was too weak to resist. He left his unfinished masterpiece for the last time. He would never see it again. The king had been exiled from his own kingdom. William Randolph Hearst died in 1951 at the age of 88, and with his death, a profound silence fell over the enchanted hill. The engine that had driven its creation for 3 decades had finally stopped. The question now became, what happens to a dream when the dreamer is gone? The fate of the house fell to his 5 sons and the Hearst Corporation, the pragmatic heirs to an utterly impractical legacy. They were faced with a monumental problem. The castle was more than a house, it was a small city. It required a staff of dozens, an army of gardeners, and staggering sums of money just for basic upkeep. The property taxes alone were immense. It was a white elephant of incomparable beauty, a treasure chest that cost a fortune simply to guard. For a few years, the family tried to use it, but the magic was gone. Without its creator, without the force of his personality and the glamour of his Hollywood court, the castle felt empty and strange. It was his house, his vision, his obsession. It was not theirs. The great emptying began, not of its treasures, which were mostly catalogued and kept, but of its life. The rooms were draped in white sheets. The gardens were tended by a skeleton crew. The great pools were drained. The house was locked up, mothballed, becoming a vast and silent time capsule of the Jazz Age, a sleeping giant on its lonely hill. The house that time decided to forget. The Hearst Corporation, a practical business entity, had to make a decision. They could sell off the art piece by piece and demolish the buildings. It would have been the most financially sensible option. Many other great Gilded Age mansions had met this fate, torn down to make way for suburbs and shopping centers, their grandeur dismissed as the folly of a bygone era. But Hearst Castle was different. It had survived against the odds. Its very isolation, once a symbol of Hearst's desire for privacy, now became its salvation. It was too remote, too unique, too magnificent to simply destroy. It had captured the public imagination. It was already a legend. In 1957, the Hearst Corporation made a landmark decision. They donated the heart of the estate, the castle, its surrounding grounds, and the vast majority of its art collection to the state of California, with the stipulation that it be preserved as a historic monument for the public to visit. This was the final, most profound irony in the story of William Randolph Hearst. The man who had spent a lifetime and a fortune building a fortress of ultimate privacy, a sanctuary designed to keep the common man out, had his creation turned into a public park. The gates he had so carefully guarded were thrown open. Now, anyone with the price of an admission ticket could walk through his private rooms, stand in his library, and gaze upon his treasures. The stage he built for his own exclusive drama was repurposed as a museum for the masses. The kingdom of the king was inherited by the people. The castle was no longer a home, it was an artifact. Today, Hearst Castle stands as one of California's most popular state parks, visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year. Tour buses, not private limousines, now climb the winding road to the summit. Visitors walk through the halls in guided groups, their footsteps echoing where Hollywood royalty once danced. They listen to a recorded narration describing the art, the architecture, and the man who built it all. The house is impeccably preserved, a frozen moment in time. The dining table in the refectory is still set for dinner, as if the guests are due to arrive at any moment. The assembly room is still arranged for cocktails, but it is a sterile perfection. The life, the chaos, the drama, it is all gone. The castle is no longer a living, breathing entity. It is a monument, a beautiful, haunting, and deeply melancholic monument. It is impossible to walk through these opulent rooms without thinking of another great American literary figure, another self-made man who built a colossal mansion to house a colossal dream. The story of William Randolph Hearst is the story of Jay Gatsby, written in stone and marble instead of ink. Like Gatsby, Hearst was an outsider who amassed a staggering fortune and built a palace to impress a world that would never truly accept him. Like Gatsby, he threw legendary parties, filling his home with the rich and the famous, hoping that the sheer spectacle of his success would grant him the legitimacy he craved. And like Gatsby, he ultimately died alone, his grand dream dissolving into the harsh light of reality. The castle, like Gatsby's mansion, is the beautiful empty shell left behind by a shattered dream. What does this story teach us today, in our own age of staggering wealth and curated realities? We may not build Spanish cathedrals on private mountains, but the same human impulse, the same Hearst-like ambition is all around us. It is in the carefully constructed perfection of a social media feed, a life edited and filtered to show only triumph and beauty, with all the messy human realities cropped out of the frame. It is in the modern titans of technology who seek to build new worlds, to escape the planet, to transcend the limitations of human biology, believing that enough wealth and enough vision can solve the fundamental problems of existence. The story of Hearst Castle is a cautionary tale. It is a profound and philosophical lesson about the nature of ambition, the futility of materialism, and the limits of control. It teaches us that you can acquire all the beauty in the world, but you cannot purchase happiness. You can build walls to protect yourself from the world, but you will only end up imprisoning yourself. And you can try to build a monument so grand that it will last forever, but you cannot stop the one thing that will ultimately reclaim it all: time. Stand on the terrace of Casa Grande at sunset. Look out over the golden hills as they roll down to the endless, indifferent Pacific. The wind whispers through the marble columns. The great house is silent behind you, its treasures locked away for the night. In this moment, the human drama of ambition and tragedy feels very small. The castle is just a brief, beautiful scar on an ancient landscape. It is a monument not to one man's power, but to the eternal, deeply human desire to build something that will outlast us, and the profound, melancholic truth that in the end, nothing ever does. The enchanted hill remains long after its king is gone.